Hi, I'm at least a week ahead of schedule here, so this video is the beginning of Chapter 6, which I believe begins on page 154 if you want to follow along. This is the first main chapter of ecology. Some of these are new concepts to you. Some of them you heard in biology back in the day. Doesn't really matter. The point is that these are concepts that you will be tested on the AP and the ACE exams. So it's very important to understand all the different terminology that we use when we talk about ecology. So without any further ado, let's go to the PowerPoint. You'll notice the different colored background on these slides, and in fact the slides for the next several chapters, because they belong to a new unit. This unit is all about ecology and how species interact in the ecosystem. The picture on the front here is from the story that happens at the beginning of the chapter. I'm looking back here. I'm sorry, I had that page wrong. The page is 149. Interesting how ecosystems can come back over a long period of time, and that happens, and it's called succession. We'll cover succession near the end of the chapter. This is just a New England woods where once all of these trees were cut down. Famously, from the 1600s to the 1800s, most all of the wooded areas in Massachusetts were cut down because the settlers needed to make way for croplands. To begin any discussion about ecology, we have to discuss the levels of complexity. Do you remember them from biology? All living things are made of cells. Groups of cells that work together are called tissue. Several different tissue layers form organs, and when more than one organ works together, it's called an organ system. Well, we have a similar concept here in ecology. First, the lowest level of complexity is the individual. The individual organism belongs to a species. So a population is all the individual organisms in one species. The community is all the different species that are living together in an area. So a community consists of several populations. And then when we get to the ecosystem, we see all of the different factors: biotic, the living things that we've already just mentioned, and abiotic, the air, the water, the sun, the soil. All those other abiotic factors are included in the ecosystem. And then, of course, lastly, all of the ecosystems on Earth combine to form what we call the biosphere, global processes. There are 5 factors in the textbook that are listed that regulate population abundance and distribution. Obviously, size is the first part of that, in which we concern ourselves with the number of organisms in the ecosystem, the number of organisms in one species in the ecosystem. Remember what the different definition of a population is. Population is all the organisms of the same species. We also talk about the density of that population, not just size, but also we have to consider ourselves with the limiting factor of space. So density is the number of individual organisms of a species given a finite amount of space. How the organisms are distributed in the ecosystem matters. Are they all clumped together, or are they evenly distributed throughout the ecosystem? The number of males and females in the ecosystem matters, because that has something to do with how large the population gets, how large the size of the population is. And then the last population factor is age structure. Are all of the organisms in one particular age group. Are they all young? Are they all older? And we'll talk more about each one of these in the upcoming slides. So let's start with population size. Population size is an equation. And population size has to do with the number of births minus the number of deaths. Basically, that's how it works. Of course, there are some other factors involved here. Some organisms will come into the ecosystem, and that will add to the population size. That is called immigration. So don't be fooled. Immigration in this context is an ecological term, not a political one or a governmental one. So immigration is organisms that come in. See the I? Emigration, easy to remember, is exit. E for exit. So these are organisms in the species that leave the ecosystem. So they have to be accounted for when we do population size as well. So a more correct equation would be births plus immigrants, and then the outputs are the deaths and the emigrants. When the left side of the equation is larger than the right side of the equation, we end up with population growth. That is, more immigrants and births are happening than emigrants and deaths.
The change in population of an organism is defined as the population gains minus the population losses. A population increases due to births and immigration. A population decreases due to deaths and emigration. If the gains exceed the losses over time, there is population growth. If the growth is faster over time, it is called exponential growth. On a graph, exponential growth resembles a J-curve. Population growth is limited by environmental resistance, such as available food and water, disease, competitors, and other factors. Growth decreases until the carrying capacity is reached, which is the population limit that the environment can support. This type of behavior is known as logistic growth and is called an S-curve.
We'll get more into those particular graphs in a little while, the difference between exponential growth and logistical growth. Let's move on to the next factor in population, and that is called population density, the number of organisms that are in an area, a finite, specific, defined area. And when we talk about population density, we talk about the factors that influence that density. Or we can also talk about it the other way around. We can talk about how the density-dependent factors have an effect on population. Density-dependent factors, then, are those factors that have an effect based on the size of the population and the space that they inhabit. And within the concept of density-dependent factors, we can talk about limiting resources and carrying capacity. Limiting resources are those things that the population depends on that hold the population down. If a population is reliant on the food in the ecosystem and there's not enough of it, then food is a limiting factor. Space can be a limiting factor. If there's not enough space for an organism to roam, as we've talked about before with the Florida panther. Limiting resources can be water, air, the number of mates that are available, can all control the population size. And as a result, the density can be affected as well. Here's an important letter for you, capital K. K is the carrying capacity. There is a limit to the number of organisms that an ecosystem can support, given all of the density factors that we're talking about. K is a number. The carrying capacity is a number of organisms, and it's based on the limiting factors. It's based on the limiting factors. So a species can grow at an alarmingly fast rate for a while until they begin to use up their limiting resources, and then that will sort of level off their ability to reproduce. They have reached their carrying capacity, K. Some other limiting factors that are density dependent. Diseases. Think about it. If all the organisms are crowded into one very small area of the ecosystem and a disease hits that population, they would all die, or at least they'd be close to all dying. Whereas if they were not all clumped together in one location, if they were spread out throughout the ecosystem, there might be some individuals that never come in contact with the diseased individuals. So diseases are a density dependent factor. Competition is a density dependent factor. And so is predation. We'll talk about predation in the next video. Density independent factors are those things that have an effect on the species without regard to whether or not they're all clumped up. It doesn't matter how tightly spaced they are in the ecosystem or how spread out they are in the ecosystem. A density independent factor is one that will have an effect regardless. Think of weather events. They're very good examples of density independent factors. A flood in the ecosystem, a fire in the ecosystem, or let's say the entire ecosystem gets polluted, or let's sprayed with a pesticide, for instance. These are density independent factors. It doesn't matter if all the organisms are living in close proximity or they're all spread out. If that flood hits the entire ecosystem, all the individual organisms will die. So density dependent, once again, those factors that have an effect on organisms, especially if they're living in close proximity. Density independent factors, think of weather events, floods, fires, hurricanes, things like that, that have an effect on an ecosystem. It's independent of whether or not those organisms live close together. Another factor that we can talk about when it comes to population size is how are these organisms distributed in an ecosystem. How they are distributed may have an effect on their population size. Here are 3 examples of population distribution. The first one is random distribution, and you can see they're just randomly spread out all throughout the ecosystem here. There's no rhyme or reason for how the different species are distributed in this ecosystem. Some species, on the other hand, have very, very planned and evenly distributed presence in the ecosystem. And you can see these organisms are very evenly spread out. This is called uniform distribution. Uniform because they're evenly spread out in the ecosystem. And then there's a third type of distribution we call clumped distribution. This is where, as we look in the entire ecosystem, we see individuals of the population living together in small groups. When I think of clumped distribution, I think of, for instance, a hill of fire ants in your backyard. Your backyard is an ecosystem, and fire ants aren't evenly spread out all over your yard, but you've probably all seen a pile of fire ants, a mound of fire ants in your yard somewhere. Since they all live so closely together, that's considered clumped distribution.